The train whistle cut through the evening air like a knife. Jacob stood at the platform's edge, his weathered fingers curled around the spine of an old Bible. The last train of the day pulled away, steel wheels grinding against the tracks. He didn't move, just watched it shrink into the distance until it was nothing but a smudge against the darkening sky. The station emptied quickly. Nobody lingered in Cedar Hollow after sunset, not anymore. Jacob ran his thumb across the Bible's worn leather cover. It wasn't his, not originally. The book felt heavy in his hands, heavier than it should. Wind kicked up dust across the empty platform. Jacob tucked the Bible into his coat pocket and began the long walk home. The town's single street lamp cast his shadow long and thin against the dirt road. Cedar Hollow had once been a promising stop along the Western Line, but those days were long gone. Now it was just a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of the plains, with mountains rising in the distance like jagged teeth. Jacob's house sat at the edge of town, a small structure with a sagging porch. Inside, everything remained as it had been for 20 years, sparse furniture, a few photographs, and silence. He lit a lamp and settled into his chair by the window. From here, he could see the sheriff's office across the way, light still burning inside. Sheriff Mills had run Cedar Hollow for 30 years. People called him a pillar of the community, but pillars cast shadows. Jacob knew about those shadows. His son Thomas had disappeared in one. Just a drifter causing trouble, the sheriff had said. Probably moved on. But Thomas wasn't a drifter. He was Jacob's boy, born and raised in Cedar Hollow. He'd been asking questions about missing railroad money when he vanished. Jacob opened a drawer in the side table and pulled out a faded photograph. Thomas at 18, standing proud beside the train where he'd gotten his first job as a porter. That was 5 years ago. The drawer also held a deputy's badge, Jacob's from decades past, before Mills took over. Sleep didn't come easy that night. It hadn't for years. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through thin curtains. Jacob made coffee and watched the town wake up. People moved quickly, eyes down, hurrying about their business. Nobody wanted to attract attention. The jail sat adjacent to the sheriff's office, a small building with 2 cells. Jacob had reason to visit it that morning. Daniel Harper, a young man caught trying to rob the payroll car 2 days prior, had asked to see him. Sheriff Mills stood at his desk when Jacob entered. "Here for the robber?" he asked without looking up. "He asked for me." Mills grunted. 5 minutes. He's being transferred to the county seat tomorrow." The cell was dim, light coming from a single barred window. Daniel Harper couldn't have been more than 25. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. "Mr. Weaver," Daniel said, struggling to stand. "Thank you for coming." Jacob nodded. "You wanted to see me?" "They're letting me collect my things before the transfer." Daniel's voice was low, barely above a whisper. "There's something I need you to take." "I'm not hiding evidence, son." "It's not evidence. It's my mother's Bible." Daniel reached under his thin mattress and pulled out the book Jacob had seen him carrying when they brought him in. "Please. If they take it, I'll never see it again." Jacob hesitated. "Why me?" Daniel's good eye fixed on him. "You were kind when they brought me in. And folks say you're honest." He pressed the Bible forward. "My mother marked passages that meant something to her. It's all I have left." Something in the young man's voice made Jacob reach for the book. As his fingers closed around it, Daniel leaned forward. "Every verse inside points to the truth," he whispered. "About this town. About your sheriff." Before Jacob could respond, the cell door opened. Sheriff Mills stood there, timepiece in hand. "Time's up." Walking home, Jacob felt the weight of the Bible in his coat. Daniel's words echoed in his mind. The young man hadn't seemed like a common thief. There was something in his eyes, purpose, maybe, or fear. That evening, Jacob sat at his kitchen table and opened the Bible. The pages were well-worn, with notes in the margins written in a delicate hand. He began to read randomly, finding passages underlined in faded ink. Proverbs 29 verse 2 was marked, "When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn." Jacob frowned. He turned more pages. Isaiah 1 verse 23, "Thy princes are rebellious, and companions of thieves. Every one loveth gifts, and followeth after rewards." A chill ran down his spine. These weren't random markings. Each underlined verse spoke of corruption, of leaders who abused their power. He continued reading into the night, finding passage after passage that seemed to point an accusing finger at Cedar Hollow, at Sheriff Mills. Morning found Jacob still at the table, the Bible open before him. He barely slept. His mind kept returning to Thomas, to the questions his son had been asking before he disappeared. Questions about missing money, about shipments that arrived late, about the sheriff's new house built on a lawman's salary. The town was already stirring when Jacob stepped onto his porch. Across the street, two deputies led Daniel Harper from the jail to a waiting wagon. The young man's hands were shackled, his head bowed. As they passed, Daniel looked up, his gaze finding Jacob's. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Jacob spent the day at the train station, where he'd worked for 40 years before retirement. The station master, Ellis, was an old friend. That Bible belonged to the robber? Ellis asked when Jacob mentioned it. His mother's, he said. Ellis shook his head. Strange thing to carry on a robbery. Maybe he wasn't what he seemed. Ellis glanced around before leaning closer. Word is he wasn't after the payroll at all. Samson saw him trying to get into the mail car. Said he was looking for documents, not money. That night, Jacob returned to the Bible. He found more marked passages, each one seeming to speak directly to Cedar Hollow's situation. Then he noticed something odd, tiny pinpricks beneath certain letters. When he connected them across several pages, they spelled out words: ledger, and safe, and evidence. Jacob's hands trembled. This wasn't just a Bible. It was a message. The next morning, he walked to the sheriff's office with purpose. Mills was alone, feet propped on his desk. Need something, Weaver? The sheriff didn't look up from his paperwork. Just wondering about that Harper boy, Jacob said casually. Seemed young for a train robber. Mills shrugged. They start early these days. Strange he'd target our little line. Not much money coming through Cedar Hollow anymore. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. You questioning my arrest? Just making conversation. Jacob glanced around the office. Behind the desk stood a large safe, the town's safe, where records were kept. Must be lonely work, being sheriff all these years. It has its compensations. Mills smiled thinly. Town takes care of me. I take care of the town. Jacob nodded and left, feeling the sheriff's eyes on his back all the way down the street. That night, he couldn't sleep. The Bible sat on his bedside table, a silent accusation. Jacob had spent years trying to forget, trying to accept that Thomas was gone and nothing would bring him back. But now, something had awakened in him. A need to know. The next day brought rain, turning Cedar Hollow's dirt streets to mud. Jacob visited the saloon, something he rarely did. He found Sam Tucker in the back corner, nursing a whiskey. Sam had been deputy when Thomas disappeared. Been a while, Jacob. Sam's voice was rough from drink. Jacob sat across from him. Need to ask you something, Sam. About Thomas. Sam's eyes darted around the room. Nothing to tell that hasn't been told. I think there is. Jacob leaned forward. I think my boy found something. Something in the sheriff's records. Sam's hand trembled as he raised his glass. Let sleeping dogs lie, Jacob. For your own good. He was my son. And I got children of my own. Sam drained his glass. Mills has friends in high places. Railroad company. Bank. County judge. Man like that, you don't cross. Jacob placed a hand on Sam's arm. All these years, I thought Thomas just disappeared. But he didn't, did he? Sam wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm sorry, Jacob. I truly am. He stood unsteadily. Some sins you can't wash away, no matter how much you drink. As Sam stumbled out, Jacob noticed something had fallen from his pocket. A key, small and tarnished. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. It looked like it might fit a lockbox or a drawer. That night, Jacob returned to the Bible, searching more intently now. In the book of Revelation, he found a page where someone had pressed hard enough with a pencil to leave an indentation. Holding the page at an angle to the lamplight, he could make out what appeared to be a crude map of the sheriff's office, with an X marking the safe. The next day, Jacob watched the sheriff's office from the window of the general store. Mills left at noon, as he always did, for his meal at the hotel restaurant. The office would be empty for at least an hour. Heart pounding, Jacob crossed the street. The door to the sheriff's office was unlocked. Cedar Hollow had little crime to speak of, at least officially. Inside, the air was still and warm. Jacob moved quickly to the safe behind the desk. It was an old model, one he recognized from his days working with the railroad. The key from Sam's pocket didn't fit the safe. Jacob hadn't really expected it to. But it did open the bottom drawer of the sheriff's desk, which contained a small ledger bound in red leather. Jacob flipped it open, finding columns of numbers and dates going back years. Shipment numbers, weights, and 2 columns of figures, one always smaller than the other. The difference, Jacob realized, was what had been skimmed from each shipment. Small amounts, nothing that would raise immediate alarm, but over years, it added up to a fortune. As he turned pages, a folded paper fell out. Jacob opened it with trembling fingers. It was a deed to land outside town, purchased 5 years ago, right after Thomas disappeared. The buyer was listed as William Mills. The sound of boots on the porch sent Jacob's heart racing. He quickly replaced the ledger, pocketed the deed, and moved to the window, pretending to look out as the door opened. Sheriff Mills paused in the doorway. "Weaver? What are you doing in my office?" Jacob turned slowly. Door was open. "Thought I'd wait and ask about getting a permit for some repairs on my property." Mills studied him, ice cold. "You could have waited outside. Rain's coming again." Jacob moved toward the door. "I'll come back another time." "You do that." Mills stepped aside, but his gaze followed Jacob all the way down the street. That night, Jacob sat with the deed spread before him, comparing it to a county map. The land Mills had purchased was remote, accessible only by a seldom-used trail that wound into the foothills. Jacob remembered it. He and Thomas had hunted there when the boy was younger. A knock at the door startled him. Jacob quickly hid the deed under the Bible before answering. Sam Tucker stood on the porch, rain dripping from his hat. "You took something from me yesterday," he said without preamble. "Coming out of the rain, Sam." The former deputy stepped inside, water pooling at his feet. "The key, Jacob. I need it back." "What does it open?" Sam's eyes darted to the Bible on the table. "Nothing that concerns you." "It concerns Thomas, doesn't it?" Sam's shoulders sagged. "Give me the key, Jacob. Please. Mills knows it's missing. He'll kill me if he thinks I've turned." Jacob studied his old friend's face. "Tell me what happened to my boy, and the key is yours." Sam sank into a chair, removing his wet hat. "Thomas found the ledger. Came to me instead of Mills, thinking I'd help. I told him to leave it alone." Sam's voice cracked. "He wouldn't listen. Said he was going to the county marshal. And Mills found out." Sam nodded miserably. "I didn't know what he planned. I swear it, Jacob. When I realized." He trailed off. "Where's my son, Sam?" "The land in the foothills. There's a cabin. Mills took him there." Sam looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "I'm sorry, Jacob. I was a coward." Jacob placed the key on the table between them. "There's still time to be brave." Sam took the key, turning it over in his fingers. "This opens a strongbox in my house. Contains a letter I wrote, detailing everything. Insurance, in case Mills ever turned on me." He met Jacob's gaze. "Take it to the marshal in Grantsville. Not the local law. They're all in Mills' pocket." After Sam left, Jacob sat for a long time, staring at the Bible. He opened it again, turning to Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." The next morning dawned clear after the rain. Jacob walked to Sam's small house on the edge of town, finding the door ajar. Inside, furniture was overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor. Of Sam, there was no sign. Jacob searched frantically, finding nothing until he noticed uneven floorboards beneath the bed. Prying one up revealed a small space containing a metal box. It opened with the key Sam had retrieved. Inside was a sealed envelope and a deputy's badge, Sam's, Jacob presumed. The letter inside the envelope was several pages long, detailing years of corruption, stolen shipments, bribes, threats. And Thomas, Sam's shaky handwriting described how Mills and 2 deputies had taken Thomas to the cabin in the foothills. How they'd questioned him about what he knew, who he'd told. How it had ended with a gunshot and a shallow grave. The final page was a crude map showing the location of the cabin and, marked with a cross, where they had buried Thomas. Jacob sat on Sam's bed, letter in hand, as footsteps sounded on the porch. Sheriff Mills filled the doorway, 2 deputies behind him. "Thought I might find you here," Mills said. "Sam had an unfortunate accident last night. Fell in the river, drunk as usual." Jacob stood slowly, tucking the letter into his coat next to the Bible. "Did he now?" "Terrible thing." Mills stepped into the room. "What brings you to a dead man's house, Weaver?" "Paying respects to an old friend." Mills' eyes narrowed. "You two weren't friendly for years." "We reconciled recently." The sheriff glanced at the open floor, the metal box. "Found something interesting, did you?" Jacob met his gaze steadily. "Just some personal effects. Nothing valuable. I'll be the judge of that." Mills held out his hand. "Whatever you put in your coat. Hand it over." One of the deputies moved to block the door. The other rested his hand on his holstered gun. "Town council meeting tonight," Jacob said calmly. "I believe you're expected to give a report on law enforcement matters." Mills frowned at the change of subject. "What of it?" "I'll be attending. First time in years." Jacob moved toward the door. "Should be illuminating for everyone." The sheriff stepped closer. "Whatever you think you know." "I know where my son is buried," Jacob said quietly. "I know about the ledger, the skimmed shipments, the land you bought with blood money. For a moment, the only sound was their breathing. Then Mills smiled, a cold twist of lips. Accusations from a grieving old man. Who would believe you? The county marshal might, once he reads Sam's letter. Mills' smile faltered. You won't make it to Grantsville. Maybe not. Jacob straightened his shoulders. But copies of the letter will. I made arrangements. It was a bluff, but one Mills couldn't afford to call. The sheriff stepped back, gesturing for his deputies to let Jacob pass. This isn't over, Weaver. No, Jacob agreed. It isn't. The town hall was crowded that evening. Cedar Hollow's residents had gathered for the monthly council meeting, an affair usually attended by only a few interested parties. Tonight was different. Word had spread that Jacob Weaver had something to say. Jacob sat in the back, Bible in hand, watching as Sheriff Mills gave his report. The sheriff spoke confidently about maintaining order, about the capture of the train robber, about Cedar Hollow being a law-abiding community thanks to his vigilance. When he finished, the council chairman asked if there were any questions from the floor. Jacob stood. I have something to say. The room fell silent. Mills watched him, eyes hard. Jacob opened the Bible, removing the letter and the deed. 5 years ago, my son Thomas disappeared. Sheriff Mills told you all he'd moved on, a restless young man seeking his fortune elsewhere. He unfolded the letter. That was a lie. Thomas discovered that Sheriff Mills had been stealing from railroad shipments for years. When he threatened to expose this theft, Mills and 2 deputies took him to a cabin in the foothills and murdered him. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mills stood. These are the ravings of a bitter old man. There's no evidence. There's this. Jacob held up the letter. A full confession from Deputy Sam Tucker, detailing years of corruption. And this deed, showing land purchased with stolen money, land where my son is buried. The council chairman, a thin man named Harrison, cleared his throat. These are serious accusations, Mr. Weaver. They are facts, Jacob replied. Facts that the county marshal will confirm when he receives his copy of this letter tomorrow. Mills moved suddenly, drawing his gun. Nobody's sending anything anywhere. The crowd scattered, people diving for cover as the sheriff leveled his weapon at Jacob. You think these people care about your boy? Mills snarled. They've been looking the other way for years. They're all complicit. Jacob didn't flinch. Maybe so. But they're watching now. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "Put the gun down, Mills." It was Ellis, the station master, holding an old shotgun. This doesn't concern you, Mills snapped. It concerns all of us. Ellis stepped forward. We've let this go on too long. Others stood, the blacksmith, the general store owner, even Harrison. Ordinary people finding courage in numbers. Mills looked around, seeing the tide turning. His deputies hung back, unwilling to draw against their neighbors. You're making a mistake, Mills said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Jacob approached slowly, Bible still in hand. It's over, Mills. The truth is out. For a moment, it seemed the sheriff might fire. Then his shoulders slumped, and he lowered his gun. 2 days later, the county marshal arrived with deputies from Grantsville. They took Mills into custody, along with his remaining loyal deputies. Sam's body was recovered from the river, bearing marks that clearly indicated he hadn't drowned by accident. Jacob led them to the foothills, to the remote cabin and the grave nearby. They exhumed what remained of Thomas Weaver, bringing him home at last for a proper burial. The Bible that had started it all rested on Jacob's kitchen table. Daniel Harper, it turned out, wasn't a train robber at all, but an investigator working for the railroad company, sent to gather evidence of the thefts. The Bible had been his way of passing information, knowing his cover might be blown. Word came that Daniel had been released from custody in Grantsville, cleared of all charges. The marked Bible verses hadn't been coincidence. They were a code, a way to draw attention to Mills' corruption without arousing suspicion. 1 week after the council meeting, Jacob returned to the train station. The evening train pulled in, steam billowing across the platform. Among the disembarking passengers was a young man with a healing bruise around his eye. Mr. Weaver, Daniel said, extending his hand. I heard what happened. Jacob shook it firmly. Your Bible did its work. Daniel smiled slightly. My mother always said Scripture reveals truth to those ready to see it. They walked together toward town, the setting sun casting long shadows before them. What happens now? Jacob asked. Justice, I hope. Daniel glanced at him. Though it won't bring your son back. No, Jacob agreed. But it might help others sleep easier. At the edge of town, Jacob stopped and pulled the Bible from his coat. He handed it back to Daniel. This belongs with you. Daniel took it, running his fingers over the worn cover. "Keep it. I think it's done more good in your hands than it ever did in mine." Jacob considered, then nodded, accepting the book back. "Every verse inside pointed to the truth," he said, echoing Daniel's words from the jail cell. "Truth has a way of finding the light," Daniel replied, "no matter how deep it's buried." The two men continued into town as darkness fell, leaving their long shadows behind on the dusty road.